Tonight we're focusing on Jonathan Stapley and his newest book, but just so you're all aware, he published a wonderful book about 8 years ago, The Power of Godliness, Mormon Liturgy and Cosmology. Fascinating compilation of notes and material here, and talking about the history of liturgy, especially, and different groups of people that you don't often hear about that participated in Mormon rituals and experiences. Highly recommend. And then tonight, his latest book, Holiness to the Lord, Latter-day Saint Temple Worship. And I'll let him give you all the details. And with that, I give you Jonathan Stapley.
Right here. All right. How's that? You good? You're gonna have to forgive my German. So, Gottlieb Wutreich. He was living in Salt Lake City. Okay, stay focused in the box, right? He was living in Salt Lake City, 1911. For 5 years, he had been living on Temple Square in the greenhouse. That got a little hot in the summers, so sometimes he would go up to the McCune mansion and stay in their basement, because he also did some work around their yard as well. After 5 years of labor, a fellow Swiss, Gisbert Bossard, French, which I can do, approached him, and we don't know why, but whether it was for the prospect of wealth or his potential disaffection or notoriety, or for whatever reason, it wasn't long before he decided that Bossard had something going on, and that he would take his keys and with him and a teenage accomplice take pictures of the interior of the Salt Lake Temple. They got 68 negatives in total, but what they did not count on was their teenage accomplice getting spooked and confessing to his mom. So the police arrested them. They played it cool and got released and then skipped town. I think it probably wasn't a surprise for President Joseph F. Smith when he got a package that included 6 of the images and an offer to buy rights to the whole bunch of them. So he immediately published those 6 in the Deseret News, and then in sort of a coup, they hired a photographer to go through the temple, take high quality images, and then commissioned James Talmage to write the book that would distribute these images and explain them for the world. And if you're of a certain age, it was the go-to book to explain the temple for most of the century, in fact. So my book is perhaps within the same tradition. Wilford Woodruff took several hundred prominent Gentiles, as they called them, through the Salt Lake Temple before it was dedicated, and according to one observer, explained much that was useful and permissible in explaining on what goes on there, and belayed a lot of mistrust through the process, but it was only a couple hundred, and there were thousands that came to Salt Lake every year and were interested in what goes on there. And basically for the entire 20th century, when asked what happens in our temples, we've had no response. And so this book, Holiness to the Lord, is an attempt to approach not just the rituals and the liturgy, but the religious work of the temple. So, if we had a screen, I'd show you a picture of the creation room of the Salt Lake Temple that no longer exists. But what I'm going to do is I'm just kind of go through the chapters of my book and tell you what they do, and then we'll open it for questions if that's okay. So, one of the most important things the temple does is that it is part of the Latter-day Saint and early American Christian tradition of performed biblicism, as Seth Perry talks about it. So Seth Perry's a Princeton scholar, and he's leaning into ritual studies and describes how Christians in early America envision themselves within the narrative and authority structures of the Bible. And Mormons do this in spades, right? And Joseph Smith identifies, the technical term would be a biblical archetype, or these ideas or narratives or stories within the Bible, and then he ritualizes them. He creates ceremonies and performances to help Latter-day Saints integrate themselves into that same idea, narrative process. And I'm going to talk about, there's several that happen, but in the first sections, first 3 chapters of the book, there's 2 that I think are most important and stand out quite importantly. So, today when we talk about endowment, most Americans at least are going to think of the financial instruments that nonprofits maintain to fund their endeavors. And so much so that if you were to crack open the church's website on endowment, it would say that the endowment is a gift. And I think that's true, regardless of the time period we're talking about. But I think it has a particular resonance with today's readers, because when they think of endowment, they think of that perpetual gift that sustains an institution or an individual. I have friends that are endowed chairs at universities. The word endowment today, as we use it, comes to Latter-day Saints via the King James Version of the Bible. So, to clothe in Greek is rendered to endow, or endue, E-N-D-U-E, which we use endow in our modern terminology. So we got Ben Spackman back there. He's a pro at this stuff. I'm not even going to pretend to do the Hebrew lexical backflip. But what we can say is that Jesus, when he's resurrected, spends time with his disciples and gives them the Great Commission. He says, you need to preach the gospel throughout the entire world, every nation and kindred, tongue, people. He says, you need to tarry in Jerusalem, wait here, tarry, until you're endowed with power from on high. So when the first Latter-day Saints, before there were bishops, before there were high priests, before there were quorums and presidents, when they heard from the mouth of Joseph Smith the word of the Lord that they needed to move to Ohio so that they could be endowed with power from on high, and from there preach the gospel everywhere, they understood what an endowment was. They understood that they were reconstructing the New Testament disciples' experience in the modern era. From there, we have subsequent revelation. So the first endowment is in 1831 with the revelation of the high priesthood. They go out, as soon as they're endowed with power, they go out and preach the gospel. In Kirtland, Ohio, evangelists come to Kirtland. They are washed and anointed and then experience an outpouring after the washing of the feet of an endowment. Joseph Smith describes it as an endowment long to be remembered. And what do? They immediately go and preach the gospel throughout the world. Wilford Woodruff is an evangelist in the South. He doesn't make it to Kirtland in time. One of the Quorum of the 12 members who is endowed comes down and tells him how they were endowed with power from on high. It's not until a year later that he goes back and participates in the process and gets his endowment of power. It's in Nauvoo then that this endowment is incorporated into the ceremonies that we are, that serve as the foundation for what Latter-day Saints today experience. Endowed with power from on high. Perhaps the performed biblicism that I think is the most consequential for understanding the temple in context throughout history and today is that in the temple is the place where priests are consecrated, and in the church is where priests are ordained. So what does that mean? So in the book of Exodus, we have the ceremonies for the consecration of temple priests. They are washed, anointed, dressed in priestly clothing. They have sacrifice, and they are consecrated. They are set apart. They are made holy for their labors, ritually pure, to function as a priest in the temple. In Exodus, we have Moses, or the Lord saying to Moses that he would have a kingdom of priests. In the New Testament, these believers are consciously reimagining the Hebrew Bible experience in their lives. So we have in Peter this idea that the believers are supposed to become a peculiar people, a holy nation, a royal priesthood. He directly quotes Exodus. But they're not constructing the temple or the tabernacle. He's got perhaps an apocalyptic vision of how Christians are to become the priests that Moses saw. And then we have John the Revelator, and this is perhaps the most important. John the Revelator saw the throne of God surrounded by a concourse of what he said were kings and priests, made so by the blood of Jesus. They were wearing the white clothing of the Israelite temple priesthood, serving God day and night in the heavenly temple, out of every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. And Joseph Smith read that and saw that and said, yes, this is heaven, and we are going to build it in the temple. So we're going to take the process of consecration. We're going to consecrate heavenly priests on earth. We're going to wash and anoint them. We're going to dress them in the tunic, sash, and turban of the Bible. But it's not just kings and priests, right? It's queens and priestesses. He expands the vision of John to incorporate men and women. And they were going to, as the book of Revelation says, reign on earth and in heaven. So today, if you were to ask why do Latter-day Saints wash and anoint each other? Why do they have temple clothing? The garment of the holy priesthood is the linen breeches that ancient Israelite priests wore to cover their nakedness. Why do we do those things as Latter-day Saints? They do them so that they can construct that heavenly priesthood on earth. So that brings us up to Nauvoo. There's a lot more going on in those chapters, and I will say, I think I saw a printout of the book, so we had some folks reading the book before I got here. There's fun footnote candy, is there not?
Yes, there is.
Okay. We have an amen.
Wait, hold on. Endnote candy.
Endnote candy, I'm sorry. Yes, I apologize. Endnote candy. There's fun sources and discursive endnotes and all sorts of things, I promise you, that you will be surprised. So from kind of a historical narration of the Joseph Smith's revelation of temple ceremonies from 1830 to his death, we have a chapter on change. And I think this is a chapter that has found resonance among those that have read it, because for a long time the church itself narrated the temple as a place of unchanging ceremonies and rituals. The Institute Handbook for the Old Testament had a quote in it that said, if you change the ordinances, then you're apostate and all is lost. And Latter-day Saints haven't had much help to process change then in their liturgies. Because for decades, or in some cases over a century, we've had sort of a stasis, depending on the liturgy we're talking about. And I go in, and instead of talking about every change possible, because that'd be impossible, from the constraints of space and also from a position of respect towards the tradition and the conventions of privacy around the temple, but we can talk about like periods of change. So we have the formalization of the liturgy in the Nauvoo Temple, and Brigham Young's development of the Endowment House and St. George Temple. We have Heber J. Grant and George F. Richards' period of reform in the early 20s, and then in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, and we can talk about the trends there. And I use as a case study the one-year rule for marriage, between civil marriage and temple marriage, as kind of a case study about how Latter-day Saints have used like what seemed to be kind of pedestrian policies to actually construct their cosmic identities. The next is a chapter on exaltation, which is kind of a fun little excursus that deals with all sorts of things. The necessity of plural marriage, Brigham Young's fun teachings about Adam and Eve. But there's also some really important, I think, material on what I call complex marriage. So Harriet Bowie was 21 in 1842 when she married her husband, George Elkin. He was a crepe maker in Stokes-on-Trent, which is just northwest of Birmingham. The following year, in 1843, they met evangelists from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and converted. But it was 6 years before they made their way across the Atlantic, up the Mississippi, and then stayed in St. Louis, where he worked in the mines enough to save to get to the rest of the way. In 1854, they set off across the plains, and in 8 days, George died from cholera. And Harriet made the rest of the way to Salt Lake City. Then in the next several years, she married Henry Querdon as a second wife, had a baby. Henry and his first wife weren't cut out for plural marriage, so they moved back to Missouri, hung out with the LDS folks. She married N.G. Wallace and got a divorce from her bishop. Bishops at that time could issue civil and religious divorces. And then she was sealed. Okay, so I missed this spot. She was sealed to her first husband by proxy in the Endowment House, sealed to her second husband. She's sealed to Alvin Bartlett Strickland the same day that he was sealed to her daughter. They also had babies the following year together, which would be super weird, but whatever. But she had 3 sealings and no sealing cancellations. And this was normative until the 1920s, maybe the late 19 teens. So women were sealed to multiple men just as men were sealed to multiple women. The distinction was that women did not live in plural households. They were sealed to multiple men, but lived sequentially in their marriages. This is important for a lot of reasons, because it challenges our conceptions of what plural marriage was doing in the 19th century and early 20th century, but also the possibilities that result from those sealings. Now, it's quite clear that in the 20th century, Latter-day Saint leaders reified a strict polygynous cosmology and sealing practice. But I think stories like Harriet's maybe push us to reanalyze our assumptions about the experiences of plural families in the 19th century. And let's face it, sealing practice in the 20th and 21st century. There are many men and women who are sealed to multiple spouses. We have a chapter on race, and I think this is perhaps, I'm as proud of this chapter as I am of anything I've written. It depends heavily on the scholarship of other folks. Some of them are here tonight. Where we narrate the strictures on black participation in the temple, but also complicate it, because in the temples, Brigham Young was also saying to Latter-day Saints that were Native American that they should be integrated into the family of God, that white men and women should marry Native men and women. And Polynesian folks coming to Salt Lake to help build and construct the temple. We have at least 4 Hawaiian men who cut the stones that made the walls of the temple and then participated in the liturgies within it. The case of the Northwest Band of Shoshone is particularly moving because they are the victims of massacre. And after their conversion, they helped construct the Logan Temple, but they also participate in the temple ceremonies in the endowment house and in Logan. And when they go, instead of doing temple work for their ancestors, they're doing it for their immediate kin, the folks that passed away or were murdered by the United States Army. And lastly, we have a chapter on funeral practice and how part of our construction of the kingdom of priests is by dressing our dead in the clothing of the temple priesthood. And perhaps my favorite vignettes are in this chapter. Artis has a vignette, and Laurel Thatcher Ulrich have a vignette in it, and I love them. So it's probably the least flashy of all the chapters, but I think it's worth your time if you're going to take some to read it. It's easy to think in an age of temples where they are literally being constructed by the hundreds. I go to church behind the Seattle temple. It was the 19th temple, operating temple in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. There were more than 19 temples announced at the last General Conference. Things are changing in how Latter-day Saints experience the temple. There's no question about that. But it's also important to remember that people traveled across the world because they wanted to offer the sacraments of the Latter-day Saint Church to their parents and cousins and friends. So with that, I am happy to take some questions, and we can just go from there, or we can go home. Gary?
How did you decide what to talk about and what not to talk about?
Man, that's a really good question. So Gary's question is, how did I decide what to talk about and what not to talk about? So Latter-day Saints, probably as most of you know, have a convention of privacy that surrounds the temple, privacy and secrecy. And they commit to not disclose certain elements of the Latter-day Saint temple ritual outside of the temple. We have to say that from the outset. For most of the 20th century and early 21st century, church leaders went beyond that specific stricture and counseled members not to talk about basically anything with regard to the temple, outside of the temple. We have, within the first year of David O. McKay's presidency, this is in the introduction, we have the first presidency of Quorum of the 12 discussing the problem of people going to the temple, being alienated by it and leaving the church. And they don't know what to do about it. It's several decades before there's a temple prep, a temple seminar they call it. And it turns out, you can go to the church history library and crack it open, it really doesn't say anything about the temple. So there's been a process. Now within the last 10 years that's changed a lot. We are publishing the Temple Recommend questions in the youth handbook, which before was verboten. We are publishing the covenants that our Latter-day Saints make, which was previously not considered acceptable. They're showing images of the garment and the temple robes. And I will say that I don't necessarily think that showing the public images of Latter-day Saint underwear does much to explain at all what happens in the temple, but I think it does satisfy that like curiosity piece, right? So with all that as context, I will say that because the conventions of privacy change through generations, and because I'm a member of that community, I'm sensitized to those conventions. I personally went with honoring the people that experienced the temple in the days that they experienced it. And if people talked about it a certain way at a certain time, that I would follow their lead. And that meant, for example, Joseph Smith and the Joseph Smith papers tried to, follow this line a little bit. Talked about ceremonies that the church has policy not to talk about, even mentioning, right? So I was willing to contextualize the work of those ceremonies because the early church members did. I realized that is sensitive. I had lots of readers that were both outside of the tradition and within the tradition to try to get feedback to see if I was, getting even close. And that was super useful. I don't think I had any church members. I had a temple president read it, who was a friend of a friend, and he gave me one note, was like, whoa, and I ignored it. Because I was like, well, this is not a big deal. This is not a big deal. So I think some people would be not satisfied. Some people might think, I don't know. We'll see. We'll see what the response is. I'm kind of anxious to see how that goes. Please.
The phrase "holiness to the Lord," which is part of the title of your book, it is on, I think, on all the temples, I believe. It's very prominent. Do you know the origin, why that phrase and where that came, why that is the one that is used on temples?
That's a really good question. So the epilogue of the book, I have this thing, this party trick that I do that I think is kind of fun. So read the epilogue and see if my party trick is cool. But what I'll say is that there's two things going on. It is a phrase from the Hebrew Bible that the high priest of the temple had different clothing than the Levitical priests, right? And the clothing of the high priest that he wore when he entered the Holy of Holies included a gold plate that he affixed to his forehead that said, "Holiness to the Lord," or made holy for the Lord. And the first temples, if you look at the plan for Zion, the Plat of Zion, it includes temples on it, and the notes on it indicate that those temples would have "Holiness to the Lord" written on them. And so I don't think the Kirtland Temple did, but subsequent, that's incorporated into subsequent temples. What I'll say an interesting possibility is that just as the high priest had a declaration that he was holy for the Lord when he entered his presence, all Latter-day Saint men and women, by inscribing that on the temple, all Latter-day Saint men and women are declared holy and sufficient to enter the presence of God. That's what I think it's doing. I don't know that any actual church member has believed that, but I like it.
Can you detangle this idea of using Genesis and the ancient high priests and washing and anointings with Masonic?
Yeah, so the question is about the Masonic liturgy and the conflation with the process of making ancient the high priests, right? So, ritual scholars will use a term. One in particular scholar will use the term social technology. Ritual is a social technology, and it is used to perpetuate information and knowledge. Look, I think the best way to look at, so for those that haven't read much about this topic or aren't aware, before Joseph Smith revealed the endowment ceremony that serves as the base for what Latter-day Saints experience today, before he revealed that ceremony in 1842, he participated in the Masonic initiation ceremony that included things like hand clasps and ritual clothing and repetition, and tells the story of kind of this conflation of biblical characters. Hiram Abiff, who is in charge of constructing the Solomon's Temple, and he's murdered for not disclosing the knowledge and secrets of the Masons to people that want to access that knowledge so that they can take advantage of that knowledge for their kind of positionality. Joseph Smith takes that ceremony, empties it of its narrative and some of its fixtures, and then uses it as a way of teaching a different story. And Christianizes it. Some of the actions, adds different handshakes. There's things that remain, like, so in the Masonic temple, or the Masonic liturgy, there is oaths of secrecy and penalties for breaking that secrecy. That's incorporated into the endowment until 1990. And so I think my personal take, so looking at the Masonic scholarship, and there's a lot of it, it's not ancient. It goes back several hundred years. And I think that Joseph Smith saw a technology and used that to teach the endowment, to communicate the endowment, and to use it as a process of constructing that kingdom of priests and priestesses. So that's my scholarly view of what is happening there. Anybody else? I can try to do a backflip. I'd probably fall on my face.
What, were there any collections or sources that you weren't able to access that you would have liked?
Oh, I mean, sure. Like, I didn't ask for certain things because I know I wouldn't probably get them. There are, so anything that's temple, like a temple document is not, is considered, so the CHL, the Church History Library, is digitizing tens of millions of documents. They redact material that is sacred, private, or confidential. Sacred material relates to the temple. Anything that's produced by the temple department, for example, is considered sacred and so not accessible. What I will say is the questions that I was answering, so if you wanted to go in and track certain trends or get into certain changes in the liturgy, that simply just wasn't possible. But for most of the questions that I was answering, or asking and responding to, I didn't feel like I was missing anything. It would have been fun to have the Nauvoo original temple records. That would have been fun. And it might have changed something, but I'm not convinced it would have. I mean, that's the thing about, there's certain things we know, we've known forever about William Clayton's diaries and the Council of 50 Minutes. And we knew kind of what was some spicy things that might have been in there, right? But I'm not entirely convinced that our narratives would have changed that much with the Nauvoo Temple records or some other things. I have been very, very fortunate in that there's a lot that is public. And a lot of things that have been made public in the last 10 years. So, the School of the Prophets minutes I use for the Revelation or the Exaltation chapter like crazy. Those are just outstanding sources. A lot of the General Authority diaries and correspondence are being made. Just last month they dropped the Penrose collection and the another apostle.
Woodsoe was pretty recent.
Woodsoe? Yeah, I mean, there's just every month there's more and more. So there's more than we can actually process. So, yeah, I mean, this will not be the study of, like, this does not answer every question. This book answers the questions that I'm interested in. Beck?
You talked quite a bit about this in your last book, but you allude to it in your presentation. To what extent are you exploring the meaning of sealing and thus of family over time in the LDS tradition?
Yeah, so the chapter on exaltation really digs into this idea of complex marriage and divorce and what that means. I didn't want to rewrite the last book, which I think does a lot of important work on that. But I think that section in particular really builds on that. More than the last book as well. So the last book, it was Cosmological Priesthood, which, look, I know. I still love it. This book, it's kings and queens, priests and priestesses, John of Patmos' vision. Like, that's the thing that gets hammered over and over. And the sealings is a way to help construct the interconnected network that is heaven on earth and in heaven.
So, will you untangle for me polygamy, quorum of the anointed, and temple ceremony? And what in your mind, what pushed what?
Will I? Probably not. But what I will say is that, so I don't like the term quorum of the anointed because it's a Salt Lake term. I prefer, so when you look at what they called it, they did call it the quorum, they also called it the holy priesthood. They called it the holy order. They had various names for it. In my book, I generally call it the temple quorum or the priesthood, depending on what I'm referring to. There's no question that plural marriage was a driver for these sort of complex relationships. And one way to read them, I think, is that for a group of converts, complex marriage connected them, sealed them together. You can't connect let's say we were all converts and we're living in Nauvoo and we wanted to create a network that constructed heaven. The only way you can do that is by subverting proto-Victorian norms. That's a fancy way of saying you got to do something a little atypical. So I think that's an important context to it. I think that plural marriage is reified through the temple liturgy during Joseph Smith's life and after his life. I don't like, it's complicated, but
What do you think it is now?
what do I think? What is?
The temple, the changes that have been made the last, let's say, 10 years in the temple with polygamy and, like the wife made the covenant to the husband.
Uh-huh. So I have a really interesting argument that you may find fun. In the chapter on change, I make the argument, so Joseph Smith revealed a sealing text in 1842, and we have the sealing text that they used in the Nauvoo temple that Orson Pratt published. He published it and Brigham Young was like, what? He's like, I didn't know it was secret or private. Brigham was like, okay. He still, he let him off the hook, but was not stoked. But now it's on BYU's website and the church history library. So we have the text, the sealing text, for the Nauvoo temple and Joseph Smith's Revelation sealing text, 1842. And Joseph Sealing's text is more egalitarian. There's not the subordination of women that you find in the Nauvoo temple text. So my argument is that Brigham Young introduced the subordination of women in the relationality of the temple liturgy, and that persisted until the recent changes. I mean, it still persists to this day, but it's less. It's been extracted.
Along with change and building a little bit on this question, can you tell us what did Joseph created this endowment ideology in Nauvoo, and then Brigham made some enhancements or changes. Can you talk about what was there before and after?
Yeah, it's a really good question. If you're just leaving it to strictly contemporaneous document, and Gary, I've been reading your first compilation just today for the last couple of days because I'm going back and rereading all those sources. Joseph Smith's Anointed Quorum, that's the title, right? Gary and Devery's book, super useful. It doesn't say much. If you're limiting yourself to contemporaneous documents, you're really limited on what you can say. What we can say is that we have contemporaneous documentation for example, the change in the sealing text, the introduction of Peter, James, and John, the normalization and correlation of the garment and the temple robes. And I make the argument about the subordination of women. I think that is a pretty persuasive argument. You may disagree.
Why did Brigham Young feel the need to change it?
You had to change it. So Joseph Smith is operating on an ad hoc basis in places that are not set up to do the liturgy, and then they have to do it to thousands of people, hundreds a day. Like you can't make a sandwich for a dozen people.
So you're saying he made this change before they left?
Yeah, a lot of changes in the Nauvoo Temple, absolutely. Absolutely. That's when Peter, James, and John's introduced. That's when the Nauvoo Temple sealing text is introduced. You have to systematize if you're going to do something at that scale. And then, the endowment house, it's really very small scale. But when they get to St. George, that's when they re-hit the liturgy again, and they're talking about reforming. And one of the new diaries that's out is Brigham Young Jr., and he's in St. George. He leaves for a month and comes back and is like, whoa, these improvements are great, right? Gary?
Do you treat, and if you do treat, how do you treat the second anointing?
That's a good question. So I do treat it. I take a very different tack. I think that largely most of the scholarship up to this point has been presentist. And so I take a different reading of what it's doing. So I touch on it in the Nauvoo section that's descriptive of the work that it's doing. And then I have a section in the Exaltation chapter on why we don't talk about it, how that became a thing.
When I was a kid, I used to light fireworks and they didn't go off. And are there some subjects in here that you just left alone? You said, maybe I don't want to approach that. I mean, there's
No.
also what you wrote. But did you?
I got everything that I wanted to talk about.
So you didn't say, oh, I'm.
Mm-mm.
That's cool.
Yeah, and so far,
It's been okay.
I'm okay. In the back?
You talked about priests and priestesses in 1831, and you then jumped to Nauvoo. Do you see Kirtland as doing something different, or did you just edit that out for time? How would you put Kirtland into what you were describing earlier?
Okay, so there's no priestesses in 1830. Priestesses are introduced in Nauvoo. So what we have is in the Kirtland Temple, we have the introduction of the consecration liturgies. We have washing, anointing. But here's the interesting thing. So all priesthood offices are inhabited by adult men. All priesthood officers, Aaronic, Melchizedek, doesn't matter, are consecrated as part of this Kirtland Temple liturgy and then participate in the solemn assembly. It's in the solemn assembly that they receive the endowment of power. So a really, really interesting question is, what does the washing and anointing do? What's it do? No, not yet. They are explicitly evoking, they're saying this is the same oil as Aaron and Moses used. They're washing before they administer the liturgy like the ancient Israelite priests do. My argument is that this is the beginning of that apocalyptic construction of a heavenly priesthood. So after this, the deacons are still deacons, the apostles are still apostles, Like nothing changes in anybody's church office. Nothing changes in the church. But they are becoming that heavenly priesthood. It's not quite like as explicit as it is in Nauvoo, but it's like they're beginning to do that work. Unfortunately, nobody like stops in their diary and says, "Oh, and Joseph said this is what it all means," right? Unfortunately, we don't have that, so we have to reconstruct it. But we do have so much because people like I've done so much work. And one of my favorite Kirtland sources, artists, it's encoded. Is Stephen Post wrote in his diary and then wrote it in code, and artists decoded it. It's such a fantastic source for Kirtland. And there's more. Like, because the church digitized so much, I read every 1830 diary that is extant. And because I did that, we have just way more sources than we've had previously to describe the temple liturgy in Kirtland. It's fantastic. One more?
Sorry, I keep asking questions, but this is
Let's
really
go.
good stuff you've got here. So I'm interested in where Joseph Smith is getting some of this inspiration. You know, we have the masonry is one thing. We have this people taking oaths of secrecy, maybe with the Danites, which is in the late 1830s, and then you have there might be a polygamy covenant of secrecy, and there's the Council of 50. And so this goes back ways, this Masonic, I think Masonic element, maybe back into the late 1830s. Do you have a sense of where this came from and when?
No, I don't think I add anything. Like I pretty much take the fact. I believe that Joseph Smith is incorporating the Masonic secrecy oaths pretty much verbatim. And I think the bits about the Danites are interesting. I just don't like what I love and what the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints gives us in bulk is data. So I love, like, I generally write about things where there's a surfeit of data, hundreds if not thousands of sources, right? And that's a case where we're just kind of left like, I don't know. Anything else? All right. Thank you so much for coming. And, just really quick, I just want to thank Benchmark for the great work they do here. I mean, it's fantastic.